And so I want to tell you a little bit about George Washington now. Do you have that picture up there, Christian? George Washington. 5 fun facts about George Washington that you might not know. Number 1, fun fact. I wonder, should I do like top 5 fun facts about George Washington and start at the bottom and move up, or the top and move down? The bottom? All right. All right. So number 5, going to George Washington's farewell address. George Washington, and I am Washingtonian in this aspect, gave a very stern warning about party politics. He says, "Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you, my fellow citizens. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience proves that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of the Republican government." But what's interesting is, you can say, oh, well, how is that about political parties? Well, he goes into describing how political parties become a receptive force for what he calls factions. He says, as avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions? He talks to us about the factions rising up in America. How these factions become a threat to our liberty. And I am always advocating for people to read George Washington's farewell address about from 1796 and read what did the first president have to say at his last chance. He even mentions this. His last chance to address the people. I mean, seriously, most people think that being the first president, he was the best president. What would the best president have to say about the most important things on his mind? Listen to what he says about political parties. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities. It is itself a frightful despotism, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. He says the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Foreign influence finds its foothold in party factions. Party factions find their power through tribalism. Tribalism causes people to look for political saviors. Political saviors get a mindset that they are above everyone. And that can actually even be, what's the word I'm looking for? Encouraged by their own party. The power of one increases the power of the entire party. And then, what do you have? You have one power, one person, just as Washington says, chief of his faction, exercising power to the destruction of liberty in America. Fun fact number 5. George Washington did not want and warned against political parties. Fun fact number 4. Top 5 fun facts about George Washington. George Washington was a non-interventionist. Now, there is a confusion about non-intervention, but non-intervention is not xenophobic. It's not isolationist. A non-interventionist says we don't need to become involved in other people's battles. Go read George Washington's farewell address, this same one. George Washington explains how he believes that America can have its greatest peace and prosperity by not getting involved in other countries' disputes. He says we need to have a neutrality where everybody's a customer. He says the very nature of having allies creates enemies. And then what happens is with allies, you are, other than commercial allies, then you have the tendency of being drawn into their conflicts without even knowing the facts, just because you want to keep them as friends. So go read George Washington's farewell address, 1796, and see George Washington's plan for peace and prosperity in America, and then wonder why we are in so many wars. Number 3, George Washington did not chop down a cherry tree. That was just a little fun one in the middle. Fun fact number 2. Did you know? You know George Washington, the first president of the United States. You know George Washington as the general of the military. But did you know George Washington, the abolitionist? In spite of the rhetoric that we are taught about George Washington, let me read to you some of George Washington's own words. He said, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." He says, "It being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted to which slavery in this country may be abolished as law." He says, I never mean to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished. These are different statements, different times. Washington inherited his slaves at 11 years old. What does an 11-year-old know about that? And George Washington worked not only to enrich his slaves, but to free them. And he gave them their own homes and their own communities. George Washington practically built his own city on his land as each slave became a landowner upon their freedom. Just a little fun fact you don't get taught anywhere else. And then, fun fact number 1. George Washington is the only president who refused to be king. There you have it. My George Washington fun facts for you today. Top 5 fun facts of George Washington. From George Washington's birthday, which was yesterday.